Under the blistering sun of the dry season, the village lay stretched across the earth like a secret never meant to be told. Its clay huts huddled together as if whispering among themselves, their thatched roofs darkened by years of smoke and rain. From afar, it seemed like any other place where families rose with the dawn, tilled the soil and offered thanks to the spirits at night. Yet, the closer one walked through its narrow paths, the heavier the air became, thick with murmurs, suspicion, and an unspoken fear that clung to every corner. This was not a village bound by kindness or fairness. It was a place where the shadows of cruelty had settled into the bones of its people, shaping their customs into sharp edges that cut more than they healed. The people prided themselves on tradition, but their traditions were often twisted into tools of control. An elder's word was not just law, it was fate, and no one dared to question the council that sat in the circle of stones at the village's heart. Those who tried were silenced in ways that left no trace, through exile, through whispers that ruined reputations, or through punishments carried out under the cover of night. It was said that the spirits demanded balance, and that suffering was sometimes the only offering strong enough to restore it. If the rains failed or crops withered, it was not the fault of weather or soil but of some hidden sinner among them. Misfortune was never without a face to blame, and the council of elders was always quick to point it out. Children were raised on tales of curses that crept into homes on silent feet, of shadows that lingered too long by the fire, of laughter that angered the ancestors. Fear was not just taught but woven into lullabies and morning greetings. If a child fell sick, mothers were told to search their neighbors' eyes for envy. If goats went missing in the night, men sharpened their spears not for thieves, but for women whose gazes lingered too long on the animals. Everyone was suspect, yet no one was safe, and so suspicion itself became a custom, handed down like heirlooms carved into the very soul of the community. At the heart of this fear sat the council, 7 men, their faces lined with age and power, their voices heavy enough to bend truth into whatever shape they desired. They claimed to speak for the ancestors, to interpret the will of the unseen. And though some villagers doubted, none dared to say so aloud, for the cost of doubt was heavier than silence. It was known that once the council marked someone as cursed, no defense could unmake that judgment. The accused would stand in the center of the stone circle as neighbors gathered, and the verdict would fall like a drumbeat, swift, final, unchallenged. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily life, women pounding millet, children chasing each other through the dust, men returning from fields with sweat on their brows, there lay another rhythm, quieter, darker. It was the rhythm of punishment. It showed itself in how quickly voices dropped when a name was mentioned, in how people avoided certain huts after sunset, in the way mothers pulled their children close when certain figures passed by. There was cruelty here, not always visible but always ready to rise, like embers waiting for breath to become flame. The village had a reputation beyond its borders. Travelers spoke of its silence, how it seemed too quiet even at midday, as if laughter had no place there. Others whispered that the ancestors of this land had been wronged long ago, and their anger still walked among the living. Whatever the truth, those who visited often left quickly, muttering prayers under their breath. To them, the village was a place where one wrong glance could unravel a life, where justice was not justice at all but the will of the strongest voices disguised as divine order. Even in festivals, when drums thundered and dancers leapt into the night with cowrie shells rattling at their ankles, joy felt rehearsed. Behind every smile flickered caution. The elders sat apart, watching, their eyes measuring every movement, every gesture. The villagers danced not just to honor their gods but to prove their innocence, to show that they carried no shadow, no curse. And always, in the back of every mind, was the knowledge that anyone could be next. For all its outward order, the village was a house built on trembling ground. Jealousies, grudges, and quiet resentments piled beneath the surface like dry grass beneath a hut. It would only take one spark, one accusation, for the flames to rise and consume everything. The people knew this, and yet they lived with it, as though cruelty were as necessary as food, as though suspicion were the price of belonging. That was the paradox of this place. A village bound tightly together, yet always ready to tear itself apart. And so the shadows lingered, curling through the alleyways, stretching across the fields, resting in the eyes of those who had long ago forgotten what it felt like to live without fear. To outsiders it was simply a village. To those within, it was a world where every kindness carried a question, every silence a danger, and every custom a reminder that no one's life was ever fully their own. In such a place, it was only a matter of time before the shadows grew hungry again, and someone was chosen to feed them. She was born on a night when the moon burned red against the sky, A night that the elders claimed would be remembered in songs. Her mother said the air had trembled when the child first cried, and that the sound of her voice carried not only through the hut but out into the fields, where even the goats lifted their heads as if listening. From the very beginning there was something different about her. Some called it a blessing, others a danger, but no one could deny that her presence seemed larger than the narrow paths of the village. She grew into a young woman whose beauty was not of ornaments or adornments, but of something raw and untamed, as though the earth itself had shaped her to hold its secrets. Her eyes glimmered like pools of rainwater after a storm, reflective, searching, never still, and her voice had a quiet strength that unsettled those who heard it. Children adored her. When she sat beneath the baobab tree, they gathered eagerly, listening as she told stories passed down from her grandmother, but retold with a strange freshness as though she had lived them herself. Her hands, delicate yet firm, were skilled in weaving mats tighter than any woman in the village, and her singing made the work lighter for all around her. Men admired her too, though they rarely spoke it aloud, fearing the jealousy of their wives or the judgment of the elders. Women, however, looked upon her with narrowed eyes, for her beauty was a constant reminder of what they could not match. Yet beauty alone was not the reason the village grew restless around her. There were moments, small, fleeting things, that made people whisper. Once, when a child nearly drowned in the river, she had been the first to wade into the rushing current, pulling him out with a strength that seemed greater than her slight frame should allow. Another time, when a storm threatened to flatten the harvest, she stood in the fields with her palms raised to the sky, and the lightning forked just beyond the village, sparing their crops. To her, these were coincidences, moments when courage or chance intervened. But to the villagers they were signs. Signs that she held something inside her that belonged neither to the ordinary nor to the safe. The council of elders, who had ruled the village for longer than she had been alive, watched her with particular care. Their authority thrived on fear, on reminding the people that no one was greater than tradition, no one beyond the grip of ancestral judgment. And yet here was this girl, young and untested, who carried herself with a quiet defiance that was not defiance at all, it was simply the way she was. She did not bow lower than necessary when passing an elder, did not tremble when called upon to speak, and her words, though respectful, always seemed to cut deeper than those of others. In her presence, the council felt something they had long forgotten, the threat of being questioned. Jealousy grew around her like weeds choking a fertile garden. Other young women, who had long been praised for their looks or skill, now found themselves overlooked when she entered a gathering. Men who once boasted of their wives' talents fell silent, their eyes betraying where their thoughts wandered. And even among mothers there was envy, because children seemed to love her stories more than the ones told in their own homes. Envy turned to suspicion, suspicion to fear. No one is that blessed without paying a price, they muttered in the marketplace. No one carries such fortune without hiding a curse. It did not help that she had no protector. Her father had died when she was small, her mother followed soon after, and she had grown up on the kindness of a grandmother whose bones had turned brittle with age. By the time she was a young woman, the grandmother too had joined the ancestors, leaving her alone in a world where solitude was as dangerous as disease. In a village where family lines were shields against accusations, she stood exposed, unclaimed except by her own spirit. To the council this made her an easy target. To the villagers, it made her vulnerable enough to bear their fears. Her difference was her strength, but it was also her undoing. The same stories that children carried with delight, adults twisted into warnings. They said her beauty was a trap, her wisdom stolen from dark spirits, her courage proof of witchcraft. Even her kindness was turned against her. Why does she help so much? They asked. What debt does she seek to bind us with? Each gesture of goodness became fuel for their distrust, each coincidence evidence of something unnatural. She meanwhile moved through life unaware of how closely the shadows pressed around her. She knew the looks, of course, the sidelong glances, the whispers that died when she entered a room, but she believed time would soften them. She still sang while pounding grain, still told stories under the baobab, still carried water with a smile for the children who followed her. To her, suspicion was like dust. It settled for a while but would be swept away when people saw the truth of her heart. What she did not understand was that in this village dust was never swept away, it was collected, stored, and one day used as tinder for fire. And so the girl became the mirror for all the villagers' fears. Each misfortune, a goat gone missing, a child with fever, a quarrel that turned bitter, found its way to her name. She became the explanation that eased their confusion, the sacrifice they were willing to imagine long before it was demanded. She was different, and in a place where difference meant danger, that alone was enough. The girl had done nothing but live, but already in the eyes of those around her, she was guilty. Guilty of beauty, guilty of wisdom, guilty of being more than what the shadows of the village allowed. The decision was not made in daylight but in the hush of night, when the moon slipped behind clouds and shadows moved like conspirators across the village. The council had spoken, though not openly, for even judgment required the veil of secrecy to protect the illusion of justice. The elders whispered to chosen men, instructing them as hunters would when stalking dangerous prey. Fear and righteousness blended in their hearts, hardening into something cruel. They told themselves they were protecting their children, saving the harvest, appeasing the ancestors. Yet beneath those reasons lay another truth they would not name. They needed someone to suffer, someone to carry the weight of their own fears. The plan spread quietly, mouth to ear, from hut to hut. A group of men sharpened their spears not for battle but for intimidation. Women gathered dried branches and bundles of straw, pretending it was for cooking fires. Even children sensed something was stirring, for they were hushed when they asked too many questions and sent to sleep earlier than usual. That night, the air itself seemed restless, heavy with a silence that pressed against the skin. Dogs barked and would not be calmed, as though they sensed the wrongness before it had begun. She sat alone in her hut, weaving by the dim glow of an oil lamp. The rhythm of her hands was steady, but her heart was not. For weeks she had felt the eyes upon her, the suspicion growing like weeds in every corner. Still, she had not expected the darkness to fall so soon, nor for it to fall in such a way. She thought of her grandmother's words, "When fear takes root, truth withers," and prayed silently that the whispers would pass like a storm cloud. But storms did not pass here, they struck. The first knock came like a drumbeat hard against her door. She froze, the mat slipping from her hands. A voice, one she recognized, called her name, not with warmth but with a cold authority that carried no question. Before she could rise, the door was pushed open and men flooded in, their shadows long and jagged in the lamplight. One seized her arm, another pulled the mat from her lap and flung it aside. She tried to speak, to ask what crime she had committed, but her words were drowned in the harsh silence of their faces. They dragged her into the night, her bare feet scraping against the dust, her cries swallowed by the murmur of voices already gathering outside. The entire village was awake, it seemed, waiting for this moment. Women stood clutching their children, men carried torches, their flames reflected in eyes that glittered not with pity but with grim satisfaction. The circle of stones in the center of the village, where judgments were usually spoken, remained empty. Tonight there would be no trial, no words. Only fire. She struggled, not with violence but with disbelief. "Brothers, sisters," she pleaded, "what have I done? Tell me and I will make it right." But her voice, once admired for its calm strength, now sounded to them like the hiss of a snake. They tightened their grip, ignoring her words. Someone spit at her feet. Another shouted, "Witch!" and the word echoed through the crowd, taken up by others until it became a chant that burned hotter than the torches. They pulled her toward a hut at the edge of the village, one long abandoned, its roof sagging, its walls brittle with neglect. It was a place where children dared not play, where people said the air smelled of old curses. That made it, in their eyes, the perfect place. They shoved her inside, the smell of dust and rot choking her as the door slammed shut. Outside, she heard the thud of wood being stacked against the walls, the rustle of straw, the crackle of torches being lowered. In the darkness, her body trembled. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts, each one carrying the weight of panic she tried to push down. She pressed her palms together and prayed, not for her own life but for the mercy of the ancestors, that they would open the eyes of her people before it was too late. She whispered her grandmother's name, her mother's name, the names of all who had walked before her. She prayed that her spirit, if it must leave, would not be twisted into the shadow they believed her to be. The sound of fire came next, a sudden roar as the first flame caught the straw. Heat licked the walls, smoke curled through the cracks, and the air thickened with the bitter taste of burning. She coughed, pulling her cloak over her mouth, her knees buckling as the hut filled with haze. The cries of the villagers rose outside, wild and triumphant, as though the fire itself were a song of victory. But inside it was not victory, it was fear, it was silence, it was a young woman kneeling in the smoke with her hands lifted to the heavens. Her heart pounded like a drum, but her spirit refused to break. Even as the flames closed in, even as her body trembled with terror, she clung to her prayers. If she must burn, she told herself, then let her burn with dignity. If she must die, then let her spirit rise free, untouched by the lies that had trapped her flesh. And in that moment, though she did not yet know it, something beyond her prayers was stirring in the heart of the fire itself. The flames roared like a wild beast finally loosed from its chain. They licked hungrily at the straw piled against the walls, spread across the brittle wood, and climbed upward in tongues of gold and red. Smoke billowed thick, pressing into her lungs, blinding her eyes. She coughed, staggered backward, pressing her cloak tighter across her face. The air itself seemed alive, hissing and crackling as though mocking her prayers. Outside, the villagers shouted triumphantly, their voices sharp as spears, chanting the word they had carved into her name. Witch. To them the fire was justice. To her it was death approaching on fiery feet. But then something strange happened. The flames did not rush at her as she expected. They crawled over the walls, devoured the beams, but when they reached her they paused, flickering uncertainly as if confronted by something they could not touch. She stood trembling in the center of the collapsing hut, eyes streaming from smoke, yet her skin felt no burn, her hair no singe. It was as though an invisible circle had risen around her, holding the fire back. Her heart hammered, her breath ragged, but beneath the terror, another sensation bloomed, one she could not name. She lifted her gaze and whispered her prayer again, her voice breaking in the smoke. The fire answered, not with destruction but with a deep, resounding crack that split through the beams overhead. Sparks fell around her like a shower of stars. They landed on her cloak, on her hands, even in her hair, yet they did not sting. They danced across her skin like harmless embers, glowing, fading, leaving no wound. She gasped, stepping back, but the flames followed, not to consume but to circle her, like wolves around a leader they had chosen to obey. Outside, the villagers cheered louder as the hut blazed brighter, believing the girl inside was writhing in agony. But within, the scene had transformed into something no eye had seen before. The fire bent toward her, swaying like grass in the wind, bowing as though it recognized her spirit. Each wave of flame seemed to breathe with her, inhaling when she gasped, exhaling when she whispered. It was not a beast unleashed, not anymore. It was a living presence, awake and aware, and in her fear-stricken heart she felt it looking at her, acknowledging her. She dropped to her knees, not from weakness but from awe. Her lips moved in prayer, not begging for escape now but giving thanks. "If you are the breath of the ancestors," she whispered, "then see my heart. I am no witch. I am only their child." At her words, the fire surged upward, the hut trembling as if struck by thunder. But instead of collapsing upon her, the flames parted, forming a glowing corridor of light that revealed the night sky through the crumbling roof. Smoke rose around her, but she could breathe as if the air had cleared just for her. Her terror began to melt into something else. Wonder, reverence. She extended her hand, trembling, and a flame leapt onto her palm, curling like a small creature. It did not bite or scorch. It flickered softly, golden, alive, pulsing with warmth rather than pain. It felt as though it carried a heartbeat, steady and strong, one that echoed her own. She stared, tears cutting lines through the soot on her cheeks. The fire was not her enemy. It was her companion. It had chosen her. And then she understood. Innocence was its shield. The fire, wild and untamable, recognized purity and bowed before it. Where lies and cruelty might have been consumed, her truth stood untouched, and so the flames obeyed. They circled her in a dance, spiraling around the hut's interior, climbing and twisting like serpents of light. The walls groaned, the roof gave way, but the fire held her in its heart, unharmed. From outside, the villagers saw only the inferno, glowing so fiercely that even those who had called for her death stepped back in fear. The heat singed their skin, forcing them to shield their faces. Yet they could not hear her prayers, nor see the way the fire bent lovingly toward her. To them she was gone, consumed. And so they shouted louder, trying to drown out the unease rising in their chests. But deep within each felt a tremor of doubt. Why had the flames grown so strange, so alive? As the hut began to collapse, she rose to her feet. Her eyes, shimmering with reflection of the fire, held no fear now. She stood tall, her silhouette bathed in light, as though she herself had become part flame. The fire spiraled higher, lifting her presence, making her more than flesh and bone. She was no longer simply the girl they had feared, she was something else, something the ancestors themselves seemed to claim. When the final beam cracked and the roof caved inward, the fire burst outward, exploding into the night like a beast released from a cage. The villagers screamed and scattered, their torches falling from their hands. The fire that was meant to destroy had broken free, and it did not hunger for wood alone. It carried purpose now, a will born in the heart of the girl they tried to kill. Inside the blaze she stood untouched, the air around her shimmering with heat, her spirit bound with something ancient and fierce. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in one last prayer, not for herself but for the village that had lost its way. And as she prayed, the fire seemed to listen, curling tighter around her like a cloak of light, refusing still to harm her. She was not burned. She was not broken. She was chosen. The night air was heavy with the stench of smoke. Sparks flew upward into the darkness as the hut burned, its roof collapsing in groaning waves of flame. The villagers stood in a wide circle, their eyes wild with a mix of satisfaction and dread. Children clutched their mothers, men gripped their spears, and elders muttered prayers into the wind. They waited for screams of agony that never came. Instead there was silence. Then, from within the inferno, something stirred. The flames began to twist unnaturally, their dance no longer random but purposeful, like warriors answering a silent drumbeat. They leapt higher, brighter, and then suddenly split apart from the hut, writhing into the air as if alive. The villagers stumbled back in terror as fiery tongues stretched outward, clawing at the ground. What had once been fire now seemed like a living beast, a predator loosed upon those who had thought themselves hunters. Gasps filled the night. "It moves," one woman shrieked, clutching her chest. The hut was reduced to cinders, yet the girl they had sought to kill stood unharmed at its center. The fire did not consume her clothes or her skin, it swirled around her like a cloak, bowing to her presence as if she were its rightful queen. Her face glowed not with fear but with a strange, solemn calm, her eyes reflecting the brilliance of the flames. Then the fire roared. It tore itself free from the broken hut, rushing across the clearing in great arcs of light. Villagers screamed and scattered. Some tripped over their own feet, others dropped spears and bowls as they fled into the darkness. Shadows stretched long and monstrous across the earth, thrown by the rolling tide of flame that chased after them like hunting dogs released from chains. The ground trembled with the heat. Trees at the edge of the village caught fire in a sudden chorus of crackling. The sky itself glowed red and gold as though dawn had come too soon, tearing through the darkness. Sparks rained down like falling stars, each one burning holes into the earth where they landed. Men tried to rally. "To the river," one shouted, but the fire seemed to hear. It surged toward the fleeing crowd, driving them in circles, herding them like cattle. The crackling of the flames turned into a deep, guttural growl, almost like the voice of the ancestors themselves, angry, unforgiving. The girl did not move. She stood still at the heart of the storm, watching as the very force meant to kill her became her guardian, her weapon. The villagers had wanted to silence her, to erase her presence, but now the entire land carried her name on the tongues of fire. One elder, his voice shaking, cried out, "She is no mortal. She walks with the spirits." He fell to his knees, covering his face as if to block out the sight. But it was too late. The flames showed no mercy to guilt or innocence. They swept wherever fear was strongest, chasing those who had laughed at her, accused her, condemned her. A mother screamed as fire licked the ground near her child. She tried to shield the boy, but instead of burning them, the fire curved sharply away, sparing the innocent while pursuing others. This strange intelligence only deepened the terror. This was no ordinary blaze but judgment itself, alive and discerning. Some villagers plunged into the river, desperate to escape. Yet even there the water glowed red, steam hissing as sparks touched its surface. Others hid in granaries or huts, but the fire snaked across the thatched roofs, circling them until they bolted out, choking, blinded by smoke. Above, the heavens themselves seemed to open. Clouds glowed with fiery light, and birds flew wildly into the night, their cries lost in the roar. To those who watched, it was no longer fire but a beast with many heads, a storm of flame galloping across the earth. Still at its heart was the girl. The villagers saw her shape in the glow, her arms stretched upward, her figure wrapped in fire yet untouched. She was both terrifying and beautiful, like a spirit risen from an ancient prophecy. Where she turned her gaze, the fire followed, answering her as if bound by unseen chains. At last, when the screams had scattered into the distance and the village lay half in ruins, the flames began to settle. They coiled back, pulling inward like rivers returning to the sea. Slowly they circled around her once more, a crown of embers rising above her head, until finally they lowered themselves into the ash and died away with a hiss. Silence fell. The only sound left was the crackle of dying wood and the weeping of those too broken to flee. The villagers who had once called her cursed now crouched in the shadows, afraid to meet her eyes. Some whispered prayers, others begged forgiveness, their voices trembling as though speaking to a goddess rather than the girl they had sought to destroy. But she did not speak. She simply turned, her steps light upon the scorched earth, and walked away into the night. The flames had chosen her. The spirits had claimed her. And from that night forward, the villagers would never again see fire as mere light or warmth. They would see her face in every flame, her shadow in every spark, and remember that when innocence burns, it is not consumed, it rises. The night that had begun with betrayal was ending with something no eye could comprehend. The hut where the villagers had dragged the girl lay in smoldering ruin. Its walls had collapsed inward, charred into skeletal frames that still glowed with embers. Sparks hissed upward into the night air, carried by the restless wind. The flames that had once roared like a beast had quieted now, crouching low, waiting as though they still guarded something within. The villagers stood in a wide circle, their faces painted with ash, their lungs filled with the acrid smoke of their own doing. None dared to step forward. None dared to speak. Their ears still rang with the screams of those whom the fire had judged unworthy. Some had perished in the chaos, swallowed whole by the very blaze they had set. Others had fled into the shadows, leaving behind sandals, baskets, and even their children in terror. Yet in the center of it all, the burnt hut stirred. From beneath the shifting rubble, a sound rose, not of crackling fire, not of falling wood, but of footsteps. Calm, steady footsteps. The villagers gasped, some clutching their heads, others falling to their knees as a figure began to emerge. She walked through the rising smoke, her form illuminated by the glowing coals beneath her feet. The girl, the one they had condemned, the one they had sought to erase, stepped into the open. Her skin bore not a single scar from the flames. Her garments, though kissed by ash, shimmered with strange resilience, as though woven from threads stronger than fire itself. Her hair, once braided by gentle hands of her late mother, now seemed alive with light, each strand reflecting the orange-red glow of the embers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "A spirit woman," one elder whispered, his voice trembling. Another covered her eyes and muttered, "She has returned with the ancestors' power." Children clung to their mother's skirts, peering wide-eyed at the figure who walked from the ashes as if she were birthed anew. Her eyes met theirs and silence descended like a heavy blanket. Those who had plotted most fiercely could not hold her gaze. They looked away, their faces contorted with shame. The girl's expression was not one of anger but something greater, an unshakable calm, the kind that belongs only to forces beyond this world. She took another step forward, the ground beneath her glowing where her bare feet touched. The fire seemed to follow her in obedience, curling at her heels, bowing like a loyal beast to its master. Every flicker of flame carried her essence, every spark seemed to acknowledge her survival. She was no longer just a girl, she was fire reborn, innocence reshaped into strength. A low murmur swept the crowd. Some whispered prayers for forgiveness, others wept openly, realizing too late the weight of what they had done. The elders, who had commanded her burning, found themselves trembling as the night pressed its judgment upon them. For the first time, their power was stripped away, and they were left small, fragile, and guilty before the one they had tried to destroy. The girl stopped at the edge of the village square. Her gaze lingered on the sky above, now tinged with the pale light of dawn. The stars were fading, but in that fading she saw the truth. She had survived not by her own strength alone, but because something greater had chosen her. The ancestors, the spirits of the earth and fire, had wrapped themselves around her. Where fire once destroyed, it had instead shielded. Where flames once consumed, they had bowed. The villagers could not stand in her presence any longer. One by one they fell to their knees. Some begged forgiveness, others whispered her name in reverence, as if she had become more than human. They called her the daughter of flame, the spirit of ashes, the untouchable. But she did not speak. Words felt too small for what she carried now. Instead, she let her silence answer, her steady breath rising and falling like the wind after a storm. She knew she was no longer just a victim of betrayal. She was a living sign, a warning, a story that would spread far beyond these huts of clay and straw. Children would remember her as the girl who walked out of fire untouched. Mothers would sing of her strength in lullabies. Elders would tell her story at night, though some would twist it in fear, warning their children not to betray the innocent lest the flames rise again. And she, the girl who had once been powerless, now stood as proof that even in the heart of destruction, there could be rebirth. She was not consumed by fire, she had become its keeper. With one final glance at the villagers, she turned her back on them. She walked beyond the ashes, her figure glowing faintly in the morning light. The air carried her footsteps like a song. No one dared to follow. No one dared to stop her. And so she became legend. The girl who had been betrayed. The girl who had burned. The girl who had walked from ashes. The village that once hummed with life now lay in silence, broken and smothered in the heavy breath of smoke. What had been rows of neatly built huts now stood as blackened skeletons, their thatched roofs reduced to cinders, their walls cracked and fragile like brittle bones. The air reeked of ash and burned earth, clinging to the throats of those who survived, making every breath a reminder of the flames that had swept through their world like judgment itself. The survivors staggered through the ruins, their eyes hollow with disbelief. Mothers clutched children, coughing and crying, their faces streaked with soot. Men stood in stunned silence, their proud postures broken, their spears forgotten at their sides. The old ones whispered to themselves, unable to comprehend how their gods, whom they had trusted to bless their punishments, had turned fire into a weapon against them. Everywhere the evidence of cruelty revealed itself. The hut where they had trapped the girl was nothing more than ash, but from it she had walked out alive, untouched, while those who had cheered for her burning had been swallowed by the flames. Some of the cruelest among them, those who had laughed when she cried for mercy, were nowhere to be found, their bodies consumed in the inferno, leaving only charred shadows imprinted on the ground like eternal reminders of their guilt. The villagers began to murmur in fear, their voices trembling as they pieced together what had happened. The fire had not been wild. It had not raged blindly through the settlement as ordinary flames would. No, it had moved with purpose. Some huts had burned to the ground, while others stood untouched, their thatching still golden against the smoke-dark sky. Some families had lost everything, while others found their homes spared as though an unseen hand had shielded them. Why, they whispered. Why were some destroyed and others left whole? And in their hearts, though they tried not to say it aloud, they knew the answer. The fire had chosen. The fire had remembered who had thrown stones, who had shouted curses, who had called for the girl to burn. And it had spared those who had watched in silence, those who had wept but been too afraid to intervene. Justice, it seemed, had walked with the flames. As the sun rose over the smoking wreckage, guilt began to seep into their bones. The weight of their actions pressed down heavier than the ash on the ground. They had followed old traditions blindly, believing cruelty was strength, believing sacrifice was power. But what had those beliefs brought them now? Ruin. A story that would not be silenced. The chief sat among the rubble of his hut, his head bowed low, his once proud headdress blackened and falling apart. His authority had crumbled with the flames, for even he had not been spared. His wives wept, his warriors avoided his gaze, and he could not summon words. He too had led the chant for the girl's burning. He too had raised his hand when the fire was set. And yet, when the flames came alive, they had leapt around him, tearing down his house, taking his eldest son, leaving him with nothing but shame. The villagers gathered in the clearing, the heart of what remained of their home. Their eyes turned to one another, suspicion mixing with sorrow. Who among them had been judged guilty, and who had been spared? The division was silent but sharp, for no one wanted to confess their role, though each remembered their own voice shouting, their own hands raised. The knowledge of their sins burned hotter than any ember. Children asked questions that parents could not answer. Why did the fire come alive? Why did the girl walk from the ashes? Who is she now? The elders, whose duty it was to explain the mysteries of the world, could only shake their heads. Their wisdom had failed. The old ways, the old punishments had turned against them. Night fell, and the village was darker than ever before. No one dared to light a fire, for the crackle of flames now brought terror instead of comfort. They huddled together in silence, haunted by screams that still seemed to echo in the smoke-filled air. Some swore they saw shadows flickering at the edge of the ruins, shapes like fiery beasts watching them with unseen eyes. Fear kept them restless and guilt kept them from sleep. Slowly, a new awareness began to form in their hearts. If their traditions could bring such destruction, perhaps their ways were wrong. Perhaps cruelty was not strength but weakness. Perhaps the girl, whom they had sought to destroy, had been more than human, chosen to reveal the flaws in their hearts. And perhaps their survival was not mercy but a burden, a chance to change or else face destruction again. The village, broken and humbled, began to whisper of atonement. They spoke of abandoning the rituals that demanded suffering. They spoke of teaching their children not the pride of cruelty but the strength of compassion. Yet even as these words were spoken, doubt lingered. Could they truly change? Or would the memory of fire remain only as fear, fading as the seasons passed? But for now, one truth stood unshakable. Their village was in ruins, not from the hand of an enemy, not from war or famine, but from their own cruelty reflected back upon them. And in the ruins, the story of the girl who had walked from fire lived on, her shadow stretching across every broken wall. They knew they would never forget. And the flames that had judged them would never let them. The fire that had once been set to destroy her became a story that no one could silence. Long after the last ember cooled and the ashes scattered into the wind, her name moved from tongue to tongue, traveling faster than any flame. Villagers carried it to the next settlement, travelers took it across rivers, elders whispered it into the ears of children by the fire at night. The story was no longer hers alone, it became the property of all who feared injustice and all who longed for truth. They called her many names. Some spoke of her as the girl of the flames, others as the daughter of fire. In distant places she was remembered as the spirit woman reborn. Yet in every telling one truth remained unchanged. The fire that was meant to consume her had chosen instead to rise as her protector. In one version they said the fire bowed before her, curling around her body like loyal guardians. In another they claimed she had walked out with flames licking her skin yet leaving her untouched, her eyes glowing like hot coals, her steps scattering sparks in the dust. Some swore she had spoken to the fire in a tongue older than humankind, commanding it with the authority of forgotten spirits. And though the details shifted with each retelling, the heart of the tale remained unshaken. The guilty had been consumed and the innocent spared. Children sat wide-eyed by the fire, gripping their knees as elders told the story. They learned that fire was not just wood and heat but something alive, something that remembered, something that judged. Parents warned their little ones, "Do not mock the weak. Do not spill blood without cause. For fire watches. And when fire rises, it does not forget." Merchants and hunters carried the tale beyond their homelands. They told it in markets where buyers paused and traders leaned in to listen. They told it at riversides where fishermen dropped their nets to hear the ending. They told it on mountain paths, where weary travelers stopped to share food and stories. In each place the legend grew richer, dressed in new words but always wrapped in the same truth. Injustice had summoned the flames and innocence had walked away untouched. For the villagers who had once plotted her death, the story was both burden and shame. They could not deny what they had seen. Some had run from their burning huts. Some had seen their cruel neighbors swallowed by fire while others, untouched, survived. Their village bore the blackened scars of that night, huts reduced to charcoal, ground marked by ash, trees singed into lifelessness. They rebuilt but whispers followed them. Wherever they went, other villages asked, "Is it true? Did the fire rise for her?" And the guilty had no answer, only silence heavy with shame. In nearby lands the story gave hope to those who suffered under cruelty. A widow beaten by her kin whispered prayers to the girl of fire, asking for her spirit's protection. A child mocked by his elders held courage in his heart, believing that the flames of justice would one day answer. Women told each other the tale in secret, reminding themselves that no hand raised in injustice could last forever. Some elders even built shrines at the edges of their villages, small places where people lit controlled fires, offering them sweet herbs and grains. They believed the flames carried prayers to the spirit of the girl who had once walked from ashes. "She listens through the fire," they would say as smoke curled into the sky. "She carries your pain into the wind." But the legend was not only a comfort, it was also a warning. Chiefs, warriors, and powerful men began to fear the story. They realized it was not just about one girl but about all the voiceless people they had wronged. Fire, they were told, had memory. Fire would not obey cruelty forever. And so they kept watch over their actions, fearing that one day the same flames might rise against them. Generations later, when storms lit up the sky and lightning struck a hut, villagers whispered her name. When dry season fires swept through the grasslands, sparing one farm but devouring another, they said the fire still chose, just as it had on the night of her trial. When a spark from a hearth flared unexpectedly bright, mothers pulled their children close and murmured, "Respect the fire. It carries the spirit of justice." And so the girl who had been marked for death was never forgotten. She was remembered not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a symbol. She was the flame that would not be silenced, the spark that burned against cruelty, the light that walked out of darkness and ash. Long after her bones returned to the earth, her story remained alive. Fire itself became her messenger, dancing in every hearth, roaring in every forest blaze, glowing in every torch carried through the night. Villagers said her spirit traveled in the flames, watching, listening, and waiting. The story became a shield for the innocent and a terror for the guilty. It reminded all who heard it that fire is never just fire, it is spirit, it is justice, it is memory. And somewhere in the silence after the last ember dies, people still swear they can hear her steps in the ash, walking forward, unburned, forever.